Hi friends, welcome back to Talevora. Before Michael Jackson became the king of pop, he was just a young boy with an extraordinary voice and a dream that seemed almost impossible. From performing on small stages with his brothers to becoming one of the most famous people on earth, his life changed faster than he could have imagined. But behind the music, the fame, and the legendary performances was a story filled with sacrifice, pressure, loneliness, and an incredible rise to the top. This is the story of Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in Gary, Indiana, into a large working-class family. He was the eighth of 10 children, and music was already becoming an important part of the Jackson household. His father, Joseph Jackson, worked hard to support the family, but he also recognized that his children had musical potential. Michael was still very young when he began performing with his brothers. At first, he was simply the youngest member of a group that would eventually become known around the world. But there was something different about him. Michael could sing with a maturity that seemed far beyond his age. His voice was powerful, expressive, and remarkably controlled. While his brothers performed around him, audiences increasingly noticed the little boy at the front. Michael was becoming the center of attention. The group eventually became known as the Jackson 5, and their rise happened incredibly quickly. They began performing at local venues, competitions, clubs, and other small stages. For Michael, performing was becoming a normal part of childhood. But it was not a normal childhood. While other children were spending their days at school and playing with friends, Michael was rehearsing, traveling, recording music, and performing in front of crowds. The pressure increased as the group became more successful. In 1969, the Jackson 5 signed with Motown, one of the most important record labels in American music. Their breakthrough came quickly. Songs such as I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There became huge hits. Suddenly, Michael was no longer simply a talented child performing with his brothers. He was becoming a star. Millions of people were hearing his voice. Television audiences were watching him dance. His face was becoming recognizable across America. But fame came with a price. Michael's childhood was disappearing. The older he became, the more demanding the schedule became. Rehearsals, recording sessions, interviews, television appearances, and concerts filled his life. There was very little separation between Michael the child and Michael the performer. The stage became his workplace, but it also became the place where he received the greatest response from the world. People loved watching him perform. Michael had a natural ability to communicate emotion through music and movement. He could look innocent one moment and intensely focused the next. He seemed to understand instinctively how to hold an audience's attention. But at home, the pressure surrounding the young performer could be intense. Michael later spoke about difficult experiences from his childhood, including the demanding environment in which he and his brothers were raised. The expectations were enormous. Mistakes were not treated casually. Perfection was expected, and Michael was still a child. As the Jackson 5 continued their success, Michael's own identity as an artist began to grow. He was no longer satisfied with simply being part of a group. He wanted to explore what he could do on his own. In the early 1970s, he began releasing solo music while still performing with his brothers. His voice was changing as he grew older, but his ability to connect with listeners remained. Songs such as Ben showed that Michael could carry a song by himself. His solo career was beginning to separate him from the group that had first made him famous. But Michael was still searching for something bigger. He wanted to create music that felt completely his own. He wanted to control the sound, the performances, and eventually the entire visual experience surrounding his music. By the middle of the 1970s, the Jackson 5 had moved away from Motown and signed with Epic Records. The group became known as the Jacksons. Michael continued developing as a solo performer, but the next stage of his life would change everything. He was about to meet a producer who would become one of the most important creative partners of his career. His name was Quincy Jones. Their collaboration began with the album Off the Wall. Michael was no longer trying to prove that he was a talented child. He was trying to prove that he was a serious adult artist, and the result was extraordinary. Released in 1979, Off the Wall became a major success and showed a new version of Michael Jackson. He sounded confident, energetic, sophisticated, and completely in control. His dancing was becoming more distinctive. His voice had developed, and his ambition was growing. But Michael was not satisfied. He wanted the next album to be something nobody could ignore. He wanted to create music that could cross boundaries and reach people everywhere. The young boy who had once stood at the front of the Jackson 5 was now becoming a global artist. Yet he was still searching for the moment that would transform him from a successful singer into something much bigger. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, the entire music industry would change with him. The success of Off the Wall proved that Michael Jackson was no longer simply the talented young singer people remembered from the Jackson 5. He had become a major solo artist. But instead of slowing down, Michael wanted to go further. He wanted to create an album that would reach people who had never listened to him before. He wanted the music to feel bigger, the performances to feel bigger, and the entire experience to feel unforgettable. In 1982, that ambition became Thriller. At first, nobody could have known what the album would eventually become. Michael worked with Quincy Jones and a group of highly talented musicians to create something that sounded different from what was dominating the charts. The album mixed pop, rock, funk, soul, and other musical influences. Michael was obsessed with details. He could spend enormous amounts of time working on a single part of a song because he wanted every sound to feel right. Then the music began reaching the public. The response was enormous. Songs like Billie Jean, Beat It, and Wanna Be Startin' Somethin' became major hits. But Michael was doing something that went beyond making successful songs. He was changing the way people experienced popular music. Television had always been important for musicians, but Michael understood that a song could become much more powerful when it was connected to a visual story. Then came the music video for Thriller. It was not simply a performance. It was a short film. There were characters, costumes, choreography, makeup, atmosphere, and a storyline. Michael transformed the music video into something audiences wanted to watch again and again. The famous dance sequence became one of the most recognizable moments in popular culture. Suddenly, Michael Jackson was not just a singer. He was a performer who could create an entire world around a song. His dancing became just as recognizable as his voice. And then there was the moonwalk. In 1983, Michael performed the moonwalk during the television special Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever. For millions of viewers, it looked almost impossible. Michael appeared to glide backward while standing almost perfectly still from the waist up. It lasted only a few seconds. But those few seconds became one of the defining moments of his career. People tried to copy it everywhere. Young dancers practiced it in bedrooms, streets, schools, and dance studios. The moonwalk became part of Michael Jackson's identity. But behind the incredible performances was an artist who was becoming increasingly perfectionistic. Michael wanted every movement to have a purpose. He wanted the lighting to be right. He wanted the choreography to feel effortless. He wanted the audience to forget that they were watching a carefully rehearsed performance. The result was an image of extraordinary control. Michael seemed almost superhuman on stage. But the more famous he became, the more difficult it became for him to live like an ordinary person. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Crowds gathered around him. Photographers followed him. Fans wanted photographs and autographs. The person who had once been a child performer was now one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. His appearance also began attracting enormous attention. People noticed changes in his hairstyle, clothing, and facial appearance. The media began discussing his personal life almost as much as his music. Some stories were accurate. Others were exaggerated. And Michael gradually became surrounded by a level of public curiosity that few celebrities had ever experienced. At the same time, his career continued reaching new heights. He became one of the most successful entertainers in the world. Awards followed. Record sales grew. Concerts became enormous events. His performances were no longer ordinary concerts. They were productions. Michael could enter a stage and hold the attention of an entire stadium with almost no movement. Then suddenly, he would explode into choreography. His body seemed to move with the rhythm itself. But success brought another kind of pressure. Michael was no longer competing only with other artists. He was competing with his own previous achievements. After Thriller became such an enormous success, expectations became almost impossible. People wanted another Thriller. They wanted another Billie Jean. Another Beat It. Another unforgettable moment. Michael knew that repeating himself would never be enough. He had to evolve. He began working on another major project. In 1987, Bad was released. The album produced several major hits, including Bad, The Way You Make Me Feel, Man in the Mirror, and Smooth Criminal. Michael's style had changed again. The music was more aggressive. The performances were sharper. The visual image was darker and more dramatic. The Bad era also brought Michael's first major solo world tour. For the first time, huge audiences around the world were seeing him perform as the main attraction. The concerts became extraordinary spectacles. Fans waited for hours just to see him appear on stage. Some traveled long distances. Others camped outside venues. Michael had become a global phenomenon. But behind the stage, his life was becoming increasingly complicated. The bigger his fame became, the harder privacy became. Michael often seemed uncomfortable with the constant attention. He created a private world around himself, surrounded by trusted people and carefully controlled environments. His Neverland Ranch became one of the most talked about places connected to him. It was enormous, unusual, and designed partly around the idea of giving Michael a space where he could experience things he felt he had missed during childhood. There were amusement rides, gardens, animals, and large areas where he could escape the outside world. For some people, Neverland looked like a fantasy. For Michael, it represented something more personal. It was a place where the childhood he believed he had lost could somehow exist. But the more famous Michael became, the more difficult it was to separate the real person from the image created around him. The public saw the king of pop, the performer, the moonwalker, the man behind Thriller. But Michael himself was much more complicated. He could be incredibly shy away from the stage. He was intensely private. He could spend hours working on music and choreography. And he seemed deeply affected by the pressure of being watched. Still, the music continued. In 1991, Michael released Dangerous. The album introduced another evolution in his sound and image. Black or White became a worldwide hit. Remember the Time showed his ability to combine music with elaborate visual storytelling. And Heal the World reflected his desire to use his enormous platform to communicate messages about humanity and compassion. Michael was now more than a pop star. He had become a global cultural figure. His influence could be seen in music, dance, fashion, television, and entertainment. Young performers studied his movements. Singers watched his performances. Directors studied his music videos. And fans around the world copied his clothing, dance, and style. But the higher Michael climbed, the more complicated his relationship with fame became. The world wanted more of him. More music. More performances. More interviews. More explanations. More access to his private life. Michael wanted to create. But he also wanted to disappear. And those two desires were becoming harder and harder to reconcile. By the 1990s, the story of Michael Jackson was no longer simply the story of a musician becoming successful. It was the story of a man trying to survive the enormous world that his own success had created. And the next chapter would bring some of the most difficult moments of his entire life. By the 1990s, Michael Jackson had reached a level of fame that was almost impossible to understand. He had millions of fans, enormous wealth, worldwide recognition, and a place in music history that very few artists ever achieve. But fame had also changed the way the world looked at him. Michael's private life was becoming a constant subject of public discussion. People wanted to know who he really was. They wanted to know about his relationships, his appearance, his lifestyle, his home, and the unusual world he had created around himself. For Michael, the attention was becoming increasingly difficult. He had spent most of his life in front of cameras, but that did not mean he was comfortable being watched. In fact, the opposite seemed to be true. The man who could stand in front of tens of thousands of people and completely control a stage could be remarkably private when the music stopped. In 1994, Michael married Lisa Marie Presley. Their marriage attracted enormous worldwide attention because both came from famous families and were already extremely recognizable public figures. But the relationship did not last. They divorced in 1996. Later that year, Michael married Debbie Rowe. They had 2 children together, Prince Michael and Paris. Michael also had another son, Prince Michael II, popularly known as Blanket. Fatherhood became an important part of his private life. Michael wanted to protect his children from the kind of intense public attention that had followed him throughout his own life. He often tried to keep their faces covered when they were photographed in public. To outsiders, some of his choices seemed unusual, but from Michael's perspective, protecting his children from the world of celebrity appeared to be extremely important. Meanwhile, his music career continued. In 1995, he released History, Past, Present and Future, Book I. The project combined a collection of earlier hits with new material. One of the most powerful songs from the album was Earth Song. The song focused on environmental destruction, suffering, and humanity's relationship with the planet. Its music video was dramatic and emotional, showing Michael's growing interest in using music to communicate larger ideas. Another major song was They Don't Care About Us. Michael was still capable of creating music that attracted enormous worldwide attention, but the atmosphere around his personal life was changing. In the years that followed, allegations and legal battles would become some of the most difficult parts of his story. These events attracted intense media coverage and permanently affected the way many people viewed him. Michael denied wrongdoing and maintained his innocence. The legal and public battles continued for years, and the constant attention placed enormous pressure on him. For the audience, it became increasingly difficult to separate the entertainer from the headlines. The man who had once been known almost entirely through music was now appearing on television and in newspapers for reasons that had little to do with new songs. Yet Michael continued creating. He never completely abandoned music. He continued writing, recording, rehearsing, and thinking about the next project. In 2001, he released Invincible. It was his final studio album released during his lifetime. The album included songs such as You Rock My World and Butterflies. But the music industry had changed. The world was different from the 1980s. The internet was transforming the way people discovered music. The record industry was changing, and Michael was no longer at the center of popular music in the way he had been during the Thriller era. Still, his influence remained enormous. Artists from different generations continued to study his work. His dance moves were still being copied. His music videos were still being watched, and his songs were still being played around the world. Then, in 2009, Michael announced something that shocked his fans. He was preparing for a series of concerts in London called This Is It. The shows were supposed to mark his return to the stage. Tickets sold rapidly. Fans were excited. The King of Pop was coming back. Michael began rehearsing intensely for the concerts. The production was ambitious. There were elaborate sets, choreography, lighting, costumes, music arrangements, and a huge team working behind the scenes. The rehearsal footage later released to the public showed a Michael who was still deeply involved in the creative process. He was still correcting details, still thinking about the music, still focused on the performance, still demanding that everything feel right. But Michael would never perform those concerts. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died at his home in Los Angeles. He was 50 years old. The news spread around the world with extraordinary speed. Fans gathered in cities across the globe. Television networks interrupted regular programming. People who had grown up listening to Michael's music suddenly found themselves remembering where they were when they heard the news. For many people, it felt impossible. The man who had seemed larger than life was gone. Michael Jackson's death brought enormous attention to his life, his career, his struggles, and his legacy. The world began looking back at the entire journey. The little boy from Gary, Indiana, the youngest member of the Jackson 5, the teenager discovering his own voice, the young man who created Off the Wall, the superstar who changed music videos with Thriller, the performer who made the moonwalk famous, the artist who became known as the King of Pop, and finally, the man who spent his later years trying to find a balance between his extraordinary fame and his private life. His story is complicated. There were incredible achievements. There were painful moments. There were controversies. There were misunderstandings. There were moments when Michael seemed almost untouchable on stage and moments when the person behind the image appeared deeply vulnerable. That contrast is part of what makes his story so fascinating. Michael Jackson did not simply become famous. He grew up inside fame. He learned to perform before he was old enough to understand what fame would eventually cost him. The world saw the perfection, but behind that perfection was a human being who had spent decades trying to create something extraordinary. His influence on popular culture is difficult to measure. He changed the music video. He changed stage performance. He changed pop choreography. He influenced generations of singers and dancers. And he showed artists that a song could become an entire visual experience. But perhaps his greatest achievement was something simpler. He made people feel something. Millions of people heard his songs and connected them to moments in their own lives. Some remembered their childhood. Some remembered their first dance. Some remembered watching his performances on television. Some simply remembered the feeling of hearing that voice. That is why Michael Jackson's story did not end with his death. His music continued. His performances continued to be watched. His influence continued to appear in new generations of artists. And the little boy who once stood on a stage with his brothers remained one of the most recognizable figures in modern music. But behind the title of King of Pop was a much more human story. A child who grew up too quickly. A performer who learned to chase perfection. A man who achieved almost everything the entertainment world could offer. And a person who spent much of his life trying to find a private world inside an extremely public existence. Michael Jackson's journey reminds us that extraordinary success does not always create an ordinary kind of happiness. Sometimes the person everyone wants to see is the same person who desperately wants a moment away from the world. And perhaps that is the most human part of his story. The world remembers Michael Jackson as the King of Pop. But before the crown, before the moonwalk, before Thriller, before the millions of fans, there was simply a young boy with a remarkable voice who wanted to perform. And that boy changed music forever. If you enjoyed this true story, subscribe to Talevora for more real stories about the world's most famous personalities. Because behind every famous name, there is a human story. And sometimes the person we think we know is far more complicated than the legend.